Hi everyone, welcome to Classic Craft Studio Tutorials. This week we're going to be looking at satin stitch. It's a very versatile machine stitching technique. It's got a lot of different uses and it's great fun to practice. If you have any questions or feedback, please use the comment section below. Otherwise, I hope you enjoyed today's tutorial. So as with all machine embroidery techniques, one needs to prepare one's fabric. I'm using a water erasable marker to draw the design onto my fabric. And after that, we're going to need to iron on some backing. I've used an iron-on interfacing for today's project, but you could also use stitch and tear if you don't want to have a permanent backing on your fabric. The important part is your embroidery hoop, because with satin stitch, because it's quite a tight stitch, it can easily buckle and pull your fabric in strange directions. So it really is advisable to use an embroidery hoop for this. So with the embroidery hoop, it's really important to remember to tighten the screw of the hoop as tight as possible. And when you tap your fabric, it should sound like a drum. So for the machine embroidery settings, one needs to put it onto a zigzag stitch. My machine has got a buttonhole setting that allows me to stitch straight lines of satin stitch. And my tension needs to be a little bit lower than normal. So if you have a satin stitch foot, this is known as a foot number A, then this is really, really useful because it's got a little gap underneath it that allows you to stitch without damaging any of your stitches. So as with all embroidery techniques, one wants to have the bottom bobbin thread pulled up to the top. This is important so you can keep a firm grip on this when you're doing your first few stitches. And it's useful to do your first few stitches covering these two threads. That way you don't have to worry about them coming undone at any stage. So after you've done a few stitches, then you can trim these off and continue working. It's a good idea to use your hand wheel to do your first few stitches, and this way you can make sure that your stitches are forming exactly where you want them to be. How to prevent any gaps in your stitching. So this is for when you're going around a curve. You want to make sure, so as you're stitching, you'll see that your stitches, as you're sewing, you'll see that your stitches start to form sideways like that. So you need to stop your machine with your needle in the outer edge of your fabric, shift your fabric, and then make sure that your next line of stitches cross over your previous line. That way you don't get any gaps. So if you're going on an inner curve, you would do it obviously the opposite direction. But you always want to make sure that the bottom of your new stitches are forming over the base of the old stitches. That way there's no gaps in how you're sewing. So the neatest way of doing satin stitch is to build up your lines of stitching. So to do this, you start with a zigzag your zigzag width set at about 2.5, depending on how big the piece of fabric is the design is that you're doing. So for this project, I started at a 2.5, and then I went over my lines of stitching again with a number 4, set at number 4 width. But like I said, if you're doing a really big design and your machine goes up to a number 7 stitch width, then by all means use this. Because this was not a huge big design, I stuck to a number 4 width, but that's entirely up to you. The only variation that I did for this of this stitch width was when I got to the beak, because I wanted to create a triangular effect. So you'll see on the diagram that it's easiest to start at the bottom of your triangle, and then as you're working the way up your triangle, you're reducing your stitch width. Because you're using a satin stitch foot and your feed dogs are engaged, so they are moving the fabric for you, you need to remember to use your reverse stitch selector in order to move around on your fabric, just as you would if you saw narrowly. When it gets to the free motion part, so for free motion embroidery satin stitch, this is a very useful technique to practice for doing your filling stitches. And you can keep it on the zigzag. You drop your feed dogs and you put your standard embroidery foot on instead of your satin stitch foot. So if you're unfamiliar with free motion embroidery, then remember that because your feed dogs are not moving your fabric for you, you need to just practice this a little bit, because you'll be in complete control of how the fabric moves. And with embroidery foot, it's also quite easy to forget to put the presser lever down at the top. So remember to do this, because it's quite difficult to see. Because the embroidery foot is spring loaded, it's quite a common mistake to have made, and your threads will end up getting tangled around your bobbins. So just remember to put your presser foot down before you start stitching. And then you just work around. For this, I was doing a circular eye, so you just work around until your area is filled. You can stitch over your previous stitches without too much worry. And a nice neat effect going around the edges is to do one or two lines of straight stitching, still with the free motion embroidery settings on your machine. And this just gives you a nice clean, crisp edge to your circles. For the final round of stitches, you might want to consider moving your stitch length selector to the tightest of the buttonhole stitches. So your machine will be stitching very slowly. It will take a long time to stitch an area, but you'll be left with a very tight, solid line of stitching, which creates a very neat effect. You can, of course, go over your lines 3 or 4 times. You can either use the same size stitch width, or slightly wider. And that's pretty much all there is to basic machine embroidery satin stitch. So if you have any questions or comments, please use the comment section below. We'd love to hear your feedback. And as always, to keep the channel alive, please subscribe and like this video. Thanks for your time.